In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of a billion-dollar blood testing company, Theranos, was convicted of defrauding investors and sentenced to 11 years in prison. But she doesn't consider herself guilty and claims that she simply wanted the best. It all started with good intentions. As a child, Elizabeth was attached to her uncle, with whom she spent every summer. When he was diagnosed with cancer, the girl decided to change the world. She realized that it was necessary to identify the disease at an early stage in order to save the loved ones, and a blood test would help to detect a huge number of parameters, from glucose levels to tumor markers. But those kinds of tests required high-tech equipment and would cost thousands of dollars, and the blood sampling itself was a rather unpleasant procedure. So she thought, what if we reduce the complex mechanism to the size of a microwave? After all, if they were able to reduce computers in a few decades, why couldn't someone do the same with medical equipment? In 1956, an IBM 5-megabyte drive weighed a ton and was transported by cargo plane, and now hundreds of gigabytes fit in a smartphone. Elizabeth herself was very afraid of needles, and hence the idea of taking blood from a vein using a miniature flask without a needle was born. Holmes enrolled at the Faculty of Chemical Engineering at Stanford, but dropped out at the age of 20 after barely studying for 2 terms. One of her professors, Phyllis Gardner, later recalled that Holmes discussed with her the idea of obtaining a large amount of data from a few drops of blood taken from the tip of a finger. Gardner replied by saying that her plan was more of a science fiction thing rather than the actual science. The answer disappointed young Elizabeth so much that she decided to stop going to her lectures. What happened next is one of the biggest scam stories of the 21st century. After dropping out of college, Holmes founded a blood testing company which lasted for 10 years and reached a whopping evaluation of $9 billion, until it turned out that its inventor was lying to everybody the whole time. A unique portable device that could produce the most complex blood test with just 1 drop never existed. Theranos, this Silicon Valley company, was called the analog of Apple in medicine. The startup idea seemed revolutionary, a portable laboratory that could perform blood tests very quickly and accurately, using only tiny amounts of blood. The concept was supposed to simplify and reduce the cost of an expensive and long blood test processes. Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes herself diligently imitated Steve Jobs. For example, like the legendary innovator, she constantly wore a black turtleneck. She dressed like this from the age of 7 because geniuses have no time to think about what to wear. Elizabeth also copied the movements and mannerisms of her idol. In the photographs, she would hold a blood sample flask in the same way Steve Jobs was holding the first iPhones at presentations. Like the founder of Apple, Holmes established a strict authoritarian regime in the company and did not tolerate objections. All contacts and correspondence of employees were monitored, and people were simply fired for arguing. But it got even more ridiculous. During all the performances and filming, Holmes tried her best to speak in a deep baritone voice to sound more convincing, although naturally she had a rather high voice. An attractive and charismatic inventor, at the age of 30, she was already the director of a huge company that was trying to revolutionize medicine. And that's how Holmes was portrayed on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, Bloomberg, and Businessweek. She even spoke at the TEDMed conference and appeared on television. This kind of Elizabeth Holmes saw the director Alex Gibney. The heroine of his film is goal-driven and firmly believes in herself and does the same to convince journalists and investors. Surprisingly, many of those who once communicated with the swindler still note her sincerity and lively mind and generally keep good memories of Holmes. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the deceived investors. Among those who invested in Theranos was Tim Draper, the first Tesla and Skype investor and a longtime family friend of Elizabeth Holmes. And then the money really started pouring in. $150 million from Walmart, $125 million from Rupert Murdoch, and $100 million from the DeVos family. Over several years, the Holmes team managed to raise more than $700 million from venture capital funds and private investors. And in 2015, Theranos' evaluation has reached $9 billion. The fortune of Holmes herself was estimated by Forbes at $4.5 billion. For the most part, Holmes was lucky to be in the right place, at the right time. In the U.S., at that moment was a medical crisis. The cost of medical services had increased, and the news about an upcoming cheap version of blood testing technology was met with great enthusiasm. And everything would be fine. But it suddenly became clear that the company did not have the most crucial component, the invention itself. At the time when Theranos had moved its headquarters to the former Facebook residence in 2012, the team had only a prototype of a unique device. In fact, it was just a box, which couldn't be fully completed. And it was impossible to present this apparatus to the public because centrifuges would continuously explode and splash blood. Holmes constantly hired new scientists, from whom she demanded to finalize the device. When they tried to argue that it was impossible, they were fired with lightning speed and new ones were recruited. Those who wanted to make the hoax public were threatened with hefty fines and court appearances for disclosing trade secrets. Eminent investors did not suspect what horror was happening in the laboratory. When they would come to the lab for inspection, Holmes had always the same plan to distract them. After the blood sampling, the guests would be taken on a tour under the pretext that it would take an hour to get the analysis. During this time, employees had to rush to the next room to use the classic Siemens analyzers in order to prepare the results supposedly obtained from a revolutionary device. And in 2013, former Theranos chief scientist Ian Gibbons committed suicide. He was a respected scientist and did a lot for the company, but at some point he realized the utopian nature of Holmes's idea and was fired. In 2010, Holmes reinstated him, but as a technical consultant. However, 3 years later, it turned out that Holmes had been passing off Gibbons' early inventions as her company's patents. When the 67-year-old Gibbons, who had by then been diagnosed with cancer, was asked for an explanation, he decided to take his own life. Instead of condolences, Holmes asked Gibbons' widow to give back his corporate laptop. The scam was brought to light by the Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou in 2015, after he was tipped off by a medical expert who found that Theranos' testing apparatus seemed very suspicious. Elizabeth Holmes began to deny everything, but the process turned out to be irreversible, and the price of the company fell off by 10 times. And in June 2018, she was indicted on fraud charges and then later convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison. And even though Holmes lied, maybe she didn't do it for the purpose of profit, but actually believed in her success? Who knows? But one thing is certain, the U.S. Attorney's Office disagreed. And yes, science is moving forward thanks to self-confident madmen who believe that they have the power to change the world. But behind self-confidence and madness, there must still be something really important, a working idea and not a pretentious one. If you liked this video, check out the TV series The Dropout, which shows the complete story of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.